Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Michael woke up before dawn on a chilly Saturday morning, as he did every other day of the week. He turned off the alarm, stretched his arms, and quietly slipped out of bed, doing his best not to disturb Laura. At 35 years old, he had spent most of his adult life dedicated to running, and the excitement of hitting the road or the treadmill usually got him out of bed without complaint. The crispness of the morning air in his lungs was a familiar thrill. Most days, he would lace up his shoes, put in his earbuds, and push his body until every muscle burned. On this particular morning, though, he stayed in bed a moment longer. Memories replayed from the previous night's argument. Laura, his wife, had challenged him with a bet that left him uneasy and oddly curious. She had teased him, saying, "Michael, you're so sure you understand what women face, but I bet you couldn't last a day in my shoes." The words were uttered with a playful lilt, but the hint of seriousness behind them stung. He remembered the conversation so clearly. He had boasted that a marathon was a marathon, no matter who was running it. She had raised an eyebrow, smiled, and said, "Prove it." Michael had always been confident about his endurance, but the notion of entering a race that was exclusively for women was unprecedented. Laura's daring proposal was more than just a figure of speech. He had shrugged it off at first, feeling that this was nothing more than a passing joke. Yet, when Laura insisted, his competitive nature took over. He told her he would do it, but only if she helped him pull off the disguise. She agreed, eyes twinkling, and said, "We can't back out now." That was how their bet was sealed. It was still dark out, and Michael realized he had a long road ahead of him if he planned to see it through. The next women's marathon was just over a month away. Sighing, he got out of bed, stepped into his running clothes, and headed to the kitchen. He put on a pot of coffee and began stretching his calves. Once fully awake, he headed out the front door, letting the chill of the early morning push away the lingering doubts in his head. He ran his usual route, the sidewalk illuminated by street lamps, the horizon slowly brightening. His thoughts raced as quickly as his legs. He knew that cross-dressing for a marathon was a bold undertaking, but he also felt a strange determination. He wanted to know if he truly had the grit to face the course under such different circumstances. He felt a knot in his stomach when he tried to imagine how it would feel to stand at the starting line as Michelle, not Michael. Would the crowd be suspicious? Could he handle the scrutiny if someone noticed his broad shoulders or the shape of his face? By the time he returned home, Laura was up, wearing a plush robe and sipping her own cup of coffee. She gestured for him to sit at the table. "So," she began, voice gentle but direct, "if we're doing this, we need to figure out the details." He nodded, breathing heavily from his run. "I was thinking about it all morning. We need to find a marathon, a smallish one, not too local. We can't risk someone recognizing me." Laura agreed. "I found one in the next state over. It's for women, and it's a qualifier for some bigger races. I doubt many of your local running buddies would be there." She showed him details on her phone. The race was scheduled in about 5 weeks. "That's perfect," he said, glancing over the information. There was a quiet moment as they both absorbed what they were about to do. Then, with a small laugh, Michael added, "We're really doing this." She raised her cup in a toast. "We are." After they both got ready for the day, they spent part of the morning sorting through Laura's old running attire. He tried on a few tops, discovering that while they fit around his torso, they were often too tight across the shoulders. They rummaged through leggings, sports bras, socks. He also tried on a short-sleeve, bright pink running top. It clung tightly, and he felt a surge of discomfort looking at himself in the mirror. Laura noticed his tense posture. "Relax," she said with a small grin. "This is only the beginning. We'll find a look that works." "I know," he replied, forcing a chuckle. "It's just new." By afternoon, their bedroom looked like a clothing store had exploded in it. Laura took measurements and made notes about items they would need to purchase. Michael realized that simply putting on women's clothes was not enough. He had to pay attention to details he never considered for himself, such as how chest support felt under a sports bra, or where the waistband of leggings hit his hips. When they went shopping, it was an experience unlike anything he had done before. He tried on shoes designed for women, aiming for the right size and arch support. He tested out different hair accessories and considered whether a wig was necessary. Laura had auburn hair, and Michael's was naturally brown. She proposed dyeing a bit of his hair to a lighter shade, or maybe using extensions. They settled on a combination of styling and a snug headband that could obscure his hairline. Just imagining wearing a hairband and holding it in place with bobby pins felt surreal. Over the following weeks, he discovered that the training itself was not the hard part. He was used to running, whether it was intervals or endurance sessions. What challenged him was the extra layer of discomfort that came from wearing specialized clothing. He noticed the bra straps digging into his shoulders and found himself adjusting them every few miles. He complained about it one evening, panting on the couch, with Laura handing him a water bottle. "You think I'm exaggerating when I say these straps can be annoying?" she teased. "Multiply that by a whole month of training in them." He threw a tired grin her way. "You're telling me? I had to rub my shoulders halfway through my run." She shrugged playfully. "Now you see why I'm always complaining about sports bras." Each day brought new lessons. One morning, he tried wearing compression shorts under leggings to reduce friction. Another day, he experimented with a supportive tank top that gave him a shapelier silhouette. Laura taught him about minimal makeup that wouldn't run off the moment he started sweating, just enough foundation to soften some of his facial features and help him blend in at a glance. The first time he experimented with it, he spent almost 10 minutes in the bathroom mirror, dabbing with a sponge, making lines disappear. He felt strange, but also determined not to fail. They even practiced a female-sounding name for him. He tested out different variations until Laura settled on Michelle. It was close enough to his real name, but softened. They practiced calling him Michelle whenever he modeled his outfit. At first, it made him blush. Gradually, he became more comfortable hearing it. Laura also insisted that he refine his mannerisms to avoid drawing attention during the race. She suggested smaller strides in his walk, certain ways to hold his arms. He tried following her tips, but he often felt self-conscious. Sometimes they would both burst out laughing if he overdid it. Despite the laughter, there was a seriousness beneath the practice. He had to make sure he wouldn't be called out as soon as the starting gun went off. The emotional side of things was more complicated than Michael anticipated. At times, he found himself on the verge of backing out. Late one night, while massaging his calves in bed, he admitted, "I'm worried people will find it disrespectful, like I'm making fun of female runners." Laura, sleepy but still supportive, rolled onto her side. "If you do this with respect and keep a low profile, it's not meant to mock anyone. The point is to understand a different perspective." She reached out, took his hand, and gave it a squeeze. "Remember, you're not doing this for a cheap gag. You're learning about a side of running you never see." That calmed him somewhat, though he still felt a swirling mix of excitement and nerves. Soon enough, the race day was a week away, and they were driving 2 hours to the other town where the event would be held. The plan was to stay in a small hotel near the starting line so he could mentally prepare and get ready in privacy. The night before the race, they checked in, and he laid out all his gear. matching lavender running top and shorts, the sports bra that he had determined worked best, and a pair of running shoes that were comfortable and didn't scream brand new. Laura helped him trim any noticeable body hair that might poke out. She fussed with the wig alternative, extensions that Laura had lightly styled to blend with his natural hair. When he looked in the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. His lean build remained, but the shapelier outfit, along with the styling, made him look remarkably different from the man who had woken up that morning. That night was sleepless. He kept running through scenarios in his mind, getting caught, someone laughing at him, or the sudden meltdown of his disguise mid-race. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest whenever he thought about the starting line full of women who might notice the smallest oddity about him. At times, he questioned why he had agreed to this, but Laura's words rang true. Sometimes, to really learn about another viewpoint, you had to step into unfamiliar territory. They got up before sunrise, the excitement tangible in the small hotel room. Laura helped apply the light makeup that would soften his jawline. He wore a sports bra and tight-fitting top, then carefully slid on his running shorts. Even with the disguise, he couldn't help but notice his reflection and think, "This is happening. I'm running as Michelle." They arrived at the race grounds early, picking up the bib and timing chip. Laura made sure to handle any potential interactions at check-in, kindly drawing attention away from him. Once he was checked in, a volunteer handed him a complimentary visor with the race logo. It would help shield part of his face. He warmed up with gentle stretches, noticing the crowd around him. All women wearing colorful running outfits, chatting in small groups, excited and a bit anxious. He was immersed in a world that he had only ever observed from the outside. He was about to begin his usual pre-race routine, light jogs, dynamic stretching, when a young woman with braided hair approached him. Her name, according to the bib pinned to her shirt, was Danielle. "Hi," she said, smiling. "Do you mind if I stretch with you? My friend canceled last minute and I don't know anyone here." He felt his face warm under the makeup. He nodded quickly, keeping his voice a bit softer than usual. "Sure," he said. "I could use the company." They bent forward together, touching their toes. Danielle chatted about her own routine. "I'm aiming for my personal best. I've been training so hard for this, but I'm so nervous." "You?" He swallowed, mind racing for a believable reply. "I'm just here for the challenge," he managed, "hoping I can last the distance without embarrassing myself." She laughed. "Don't worry, you'll do great." Laura stood a few feet away, watching the exchange, a subtle look of pride mixed with amusement on her face. Michael recognized her expression. It was as if she was saying, "You can do this." Soon enough, runners were called to the starting line. Michael positioned himself somewhere in the middle. He felt the press of shoulders and elbows around him, the excitement buzzing in the air. The national anthem played, followed by a short announcement from the organizers. Finally, the race official raised the starter pistol, and the crack of the gun echoed through the crisp morning. The women surged forward in a wave of color and determination. Michael found his rhythm easily at first. The fresh air hit his face, and the adrenaline pumped through his veins. But the little things felt different. The sports bra pressed against his chest in a way that distracted him. The wig extension perched on his head bounced, making him more conscious of each movement. He tried not to look around too conspicuously. He focused on the road ahead and the crowd of runners around him. Within the first few miles, he realized the biggest challenge might not be the physical strain, but the mental toll of keeping up the disguise. He overheard bits of conversation, women chatting about their families, their training, their excitement for crossing the finish line. Danielle jogged up alongside him again and began to talk. "How are you feeling?" she asked between measured breaths. He nodded. "Good. Trying to get into my groove." She grinned, sweat glistening on her forehead. "Same here. You're keeping a nice pace. Mind if I stick with you?" He couldn't think of a polite excuse to separate, so he forced a smile. "No problem." Although he was used to running alone, having a companion, particularly one who believed him to be a fellow female runner, felt almost surreal. Still, he appreciated the positivity she brought. It grounded him, gave him something to focus on other than his worries. As they reached the halfway mark, they approached a water station. Spectators lined the sidewalks, cheering and clapping, handing out cups of electrolyte drinks. Michael slowed, feeling the dryness in his mouth. He grabbed a cup and sipped carefully. He glanced around, thankful that no one was staring at him, as if he didn't belong. Instead, they urged him forward with encouraging shouts of, "You can do it!" At one point, Danielle looked at him with bright eyes. "If we keep this pace, we'll definitely reach a time we can brag about." She offered him a high five, which he returned, trying not to speak too often. He was conscious of the pitch of his voice. In the back of his mind, he worried that too many words might break the illusion. However, Danielle didn't seem suspicious. She was immersed in the communal experience of the race, just like everyone else. Around mile 15, Michael began to feel the usual strain in his legs. His calves tightened, and a dull ache settled in his quads. He was used to pushing through. The difference now was the mental tension of staying in character. He noticed the straps of the sports bra rubbing uncomfortably, and the knowledge of his wig shifting made his shoulders tighten. Part of him wished he could rip it all off and run without concern, but he was committed. He pressed on, inhaling and exhaling with each stride. By mile 20, the race was thinning out. Runners spread more widely, and some were clearly hitting a wall. Michael felt the burn. He was no stranger to the infamous wall that marathoners often speak about. He steeled himself, determined to keep going. Danielle was still close by, clearly grappling with her own fatigue, but refusing to slow. As they approached a small hill, Danielle groaned. "I forgot about this incline." "Let's take it steady," he suggested in a short reply. He focused on planting his feet gently, pushing upward. His heartbeat hammered in his ears. Memories of all his tough training sessions flashed in his mind. He was reminded of all the times Laura had dared him to face bigger challenges. This bet, as strange as it was, tested him in ways he never anticipated. Sweat poured down his face, smudging the light foundation. He hoped it didn't compromise his appearance too much. With a grunt, he crested the hill, relief washing over him as the incline leveled out. Danielle caught up, breathing heavily but still wearing a determined smile. Around them, spectators continued to cheer. Some held signs for loved ones, others clapped and gave out encouraging remarks to every runner who passed. Michael saw Laura's face among the crowd at one corner, camera phone in hand, cheering, "Keep going, Michelle. Almost there." The sound of that name still made him tense, but he was thankful for her presence. The final miles were a mental game. He imagined the finish line and the sense of triumph that always awaited him in a marathon's last stretch. Danielle turned to him. "We've come this far," she panted. "No quitting now, right?" "Right," he said, forcing a grin. He pumped his arms, driving his legs forward with everything he had left. His lungs felt like they were on fire, but it was a familiar burn. This was the same challenge he'd embraced in every marathon. He just had a different identity now. The official clock came into view as they turned a corner. The finishing chute was lined with people. He could hear the announcer calling out names as runners crossed. He heard roars of delight and saw the bright banner marking the end. Danielle mustered a final kick, surging ahead, and he followed suit. Their strides fell in sync. The pain in his legs melted into sheer determination. The finish line rapidly approached. Time seemed to slow, as if each second stretched out. Then, in a rush, they passed under the banner. The crowd cheered. The cameras flashed. He staggered to a jog, then a walk. Danielle turned to him, high-fiving him with excitement. "We did it!" He nodded, swallowing hard. Sweat dripped down his face, and his heart felt like it was about to burst. "Good job," he murmured. If he had more energy, he might have said something more celebratory, but he settled for a breathless grin. The two parted as volunteers handed them medals and took off their timing chips. He felt the weight of the finisher's medal around his neck. The clang of the medal felt like both triumph and relief. He spotted Laura weaving through the crowd toward him. The moment she reached him, she enveloped him in a hug, uncaring about the sweat. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly into his ear. There was a hint of amazement in her voice. "Your time was fantastic." He exhaled, feeling the tension of the day slide off his shoulders. "Thanks," he managed. "That was intense." She guided him away from the thick of the crowd, and they found a quieter spot near a tree. He could finally take a moment to sit on the grass. He touched his wig extension, noticing it was still clinging to his scalp. He gave a self-conscious smile. "I can't believe I actually pulled it off." Laura crouched beside him, handing him a water bottle. "You blended in seamlessly. Nobody batted an eye." She brushed a stray strand of hair from his forehead, looking both amused and touched. "You're amazing." Danielle, metal gleaming in the sunlight, approached them. "Hey, Michelle, I'm heading to grab some post-race snacks. You want to come with? They've got bananas, granola bars, bagels, the works." She gave an inviting smile, not suspecting a thing about him. Michael looked at Laura, an unspoken question in his eyes. Laura gave a slight nod. "Go enjoy the after-party," she said. "I'll be here waiting." He joined Danielle at a nearby table where volunteers handed out refreshments. A sense of camaraderie filled the air. Women chatted about the course, their training, the hills. Some cooled down with gentle stretches, others relaxed with cups of sports drinks. Michael sipped his own beverage, occasionally throwing in a comment about the run, grateful that no one seemed to suspect anything unusual. Danielle was exuberant. "I shaved a few minutes off my personal best. Did you see your time yet?" He shook his head. "I haven't checked, but I think I did pretty well." His heart still pounded from the thrill of finishing. One of the volunteers pointed them to a results board on a large screen near a cluster of tents. Danielle insisted they check their times. Michael followed her, scanning rows of names and times. He found Michelle Morrison, with a time that was a couple of minutes slower than his typical marathon results, likely due to the gear and the caution he had to maintain. Still, it was a respectable time. He felt a surge of relief and a faint wave of pride. In that moment, he realized he'd experienced something entirely different from any of his past marathons. He had run surrounded by women, feeling both the warmth and pressure of that environment. Danielle squealed when she saw her time, then playfully nudged him. "We rocked it, Michelle." He gave a tired but genuine grin. "Yes, we did." Inside, he felt grateful for her companionship, even if she had no idea who he really was. After lingering at the post-race area for a while, Michael excused himself and made his way back to where Laura sat on a bench, scrolling through her phone. She looked up with excitement. "You might have a new friend in Danielle, huh?" He chuckled. "She's nice, very dedicated runner." Laura reached out to fix the wig. "I got some great pictures. You'll want to see them later." Then she stood and said quietly, "We should probably get you back to the hotel so you can finally wash off. You'll feel better once you're back in your regular clothes." He nodded, a swirl of emotions running through him. Relief, exhaustion, and something else he couldn't quite name. The hustle of the event continued behind them as they navigated back to the car. Once they returned to the hotel, he made a beeline for the shower. He took his time under the hot water, letting his stiff muscles loosen. Little by little, he peeled away the layers that had marked him as Michelle. The sports bra, the wig extension, the makeup that had mostly run off by now. When he emerged with a towel wrapped around his waist, he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror and noted the faint traces of foundation near his jaw. He wiped them away. There in his reflection was Michael once again. Laura handed him a clean set of his usual clothes. He slipped into the worn-in jeans and a simple t-shirt, relishing the familiarity. When he finally sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion hit him like a wave. But Laura joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern evident in her tone. He nodded slowly. "Just tired." That was a lot to process. She seemed to understand and said nothing for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and handed him his medal. "You earned this," she said softly. He turned the medal over in his hands, the same type of medal the other female finishers received. He couldn't help but think about the women he had run alongside, about how none of them ever suspected him. It sparked a realization about the challenges and experiences they faced. He remembered the jokes he used to make with his running buddies about how male runners would have an edge in a women's race. But now, wearing that bra, feeling that wig bounce, and trying to move inconspicuously through the crowd, he felt a different sense of awareness. Later, they decided to grab dinner at a small restaurant near the hotel. Michael was back in his regular clothes, hair damp from the shower, stubble already forming on his chin. Laura held his hand as they walked. They slipped into a quiet booth, still wearing their race day wristbands since they hadn't taken them off yet. While they waited for their meals, Laura asked, "So, how does it feel knowing you did it? You lived up to the bet." He sighed, swirling a straw in his glass of water. "Hard to describe," he admitted. "Part of me is just relieved I wasn't caught. Another part is thinking about how different it felt to run in women's clothing, how people talk to each other in the race, the looks from spectators. Everything." She nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "And what do you think about the assumption that running is just running, no matter your gender?" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. Physically, running is running, sure, but the social aspect, the expectations, the equipment, it's more complicated than I thought. He sipped his water. "I didn't realize how much more mental load there can be." Laura reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Well, I've been telling you for years, in my own subtle ways. Sometimes hearing it isn't enough. I guess you needed to see for yourself." "I guess so," he replied, giving a lopsided grin. "But let's not forget, this was all your idea." She laughed, and for a moment, the tension that had built between them prior to this bet seemed to vanish. They enjoyed their meal, talking about light-hearted things, sharing new inside jokes about picking out the perfect wig. In a strange way, it brought them closer. That night, Michael slept like a rock, a deep exhaustion giving way to dreamless rest. The next day, they packed up, checked out of the hotel, and headed back home. On the drive, Michael kept rolling down the window, letting the breeze wash over him as if to blow away the remaining traces of the marathon's disguise. Yet he couldn't shake the sense that he had stepped into a world that was usually closed to him, and it had changed how he viewed everything. Once home, life resumed its familiar rhythm. He woke up on weekdays, went for his run, came back to coffee with Laura. Yet, subtle things had changed. He found himself more attentive when Laura mentioned struggles with clothing or gear for her runs. A few days after the marathon, she spotted him fiddling with a sports bra strap he had found in their laundry basket. She teased him. "Missing it already?" He snorted, tossing it aside, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes that wasn't there before. He also received a text message from Danielle a few days after the event. When they exchanged numbers at the race, she thought she was simply making a new friend. "Hey, Michelle, I found some great pictures of us crossing the finish line," she wrote, followed by a handful of celebratory emojis. "Do you want me to send them over?" Michael stared at the message, a pang of guilt tugging at him. He showed Laura, who gave him a sympathetic look. "You can't just ghost her," Laura said. "She thinks you two bonded over that race." He ran a hand over his face, pondering. "What do I say? That Michelle was an alias? I can't just come clean without consequences. It might anger her or make her feel betrayed." Laura nodded. "It's a tough spot, but maybe a polite lie is best. Just say you're moving out of town or something. As much as it hurts, you have to end the conversation gently." That evening, he typed out a message to Danielle. "Hey, thanks so much for the offer. I'm actually on a break from running and traveling for a while, so I might not be able to keep in touch. Good luck with your next race." His heart felt heavy sending it, but he knew he couldn't maintain the friendship under false pretenses. The following weekend, Michael and Laura decided to go for a run together. It was a crisp morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the trees. They jogged side by side through the neighborhood park. He wore his usual running tank and shorts, feeling the cool breeze on his arms. She wore leggings and a bright hoodie, hair pulled back in a ponytail. Their feet hit the pavement in a comforting rhythm, one that spoke of familiarity and partnership. At one point, Laura slowed to a walk, and Michael followed suit. She pointed to a group of female runners doing sprints in a field. "That used to be me and my friend," she said softly. "We had a small group. We'd push each other, stay motivated. I really should get back to that. Seeing you run that marathon as Michelle reminded me how much community matters." He turned to face her, chest still heaving from the run. "I didn't know it meant that much to you." She gave a tiny shrug. "Sometimes we don't tell our partners everything we experience, especially if we think they can't relate." She gave him a subtle, knowing look. He remembered their bet, how she had teased him about not being able to handle her world. In a way, he had finally seen a slice of it. They continued their jog. By the time they reached home, the sun was higher, and the day felt full of promise. Michael peeled off his shoes, and as he walked inside, he stopped by the table where his medal from the women's marathon still lay. He picked it up, ran his thumb over its surface, and thought about how it might be a reminder of a bet that had opened his eyes. He decided to place it in a small display case in his office, not boasting about it, but keeping it as a subtle keepsake of that unusual challenge. Over the next few weeks, Michael found himself in occasional conversation with fellow male runners who would joke about female-only races. He remembered hearing such remarks before and never thinking much of them. One day, during a cool-down with two of his running buddies, James and Oscar, they brought up a popular female marathoner who was making headlines. James commented, "I mean, it's impressive, but come on. If she wants to compete at a top level, maybe she should just run with everyone else. Why have a separate race?" Oscar shrugged. "I guess it's a tradition. Besides, more people competing is good for the sport." Michael kept quiet, an odd feeling in his stomach. He thought about how easily he might have joined in with James a month ago. Instead, he took a moment, then spoke softly. "You ever stop to think that maybe separate races aren't just about times, but about having a space where people don't feel overshadowed or judged in certain ways?" James raised an eyebrow at him. "You're sounding different these days, man." Michael just gave a slight smirk. "Maybe I've learned something new." The conversation moved on, but Michael couldn't ignore the spark of realization that his perspective had shifted. He didn't feel the need to broadcast the story of what he had done, but it colored the way he interacted in subtle ways. Meanwhile, Laura picked up her old running group again, and she came home from their sessions happier, more fulfilled. He felt grateful for that change. Their marriage grew stronger, not through big declarations, but through small moments of understanding. Months passed, and he continued to push himself in his running goals. One evening, as he was scrolling through his email, he noticed a message about another marathon scheduled in a nearby city. This one was open to all. but it was organized by the same group that had organized the women's marathon. It promised a route that wound through scenic neighborhoods, plus a focus on uplifting all runners. He showed it to Laura. "Thinking of signing up," he said. "You want to do it with me?" She raised an eyebrow. "Together?" "Yeah. We can train, race, and cross that finish line side by side. Our real names, no disguises." Her expression softened. "I'd like that." Then she grinned playfully. "I hope you aren't expecting me to outrun you. You've been at this a lot longer than I have." He shrugged, a gentle smile forming on his face. "Who knows? You might surprise me." They signed up, and a new cycle of training began, this time as partners supporting one another openly. When race day arrived, they both stood at the starting line, Michael in his typical race gear, Laura in hers, the sun just beginning to warm the sky. The excitement and nerves were the same as always, but there was an added layer of companionship that made it feel different. They shared a look of determination as the race began. They didn't run at exactly the same pace. Laura encouraged him to push forward if he felt the need, but Michael decided to hang back with her for as long as she wanted. The crowd of runners was diverse, men and women of all ages. He recognized the spirit of community he had glimpsed in the women's marathon, and he appreciated it in a new way. As Laura's pace began to slow around mile 14, she told him, "Go ahead, I'll be fine." He hesitated, then planted a quick kiss on her cheek, forging ahead to see what time he could manage. When he crossed the finish line, heart pounding, he was greeted by a roar from spectators. Not long after, Laura came in, her face flushed, her breath ragged, but her eyes shining with pride. He wrapped his arms around her as she stumbled into the finisher's area. "You did great," he said, meaning it more deeply than before. They took a photo together, medals dangling side by side. This time, his race medal was earned under his true name. Yet, as he posed, he remembered the other medals safely tucked away at home. He knew the story behind that one would remain with him. As they left the race grounds, they found a quiet spot on a bench, the buzz of finishers around them still loud. They sipped cool water, letting their breathing return to normal. Laura looked at him, smiling through her exhaustion. "Remember our bet?" she asked, eyebrows raised playfully. He nodded, recalling everything that had led him to run a marathon disguised as Michelle. "I remember every bit of it." "What do you think your biggest takeaway is?" she asked, her gaze searching. She didn't want a superficial answer. He thought about the long training sessions with bra straps biting into his shoulders, the sense of vulnerability while mingling among other female runners, the hush that fell over him whenever someone struck up a conversation, the emotional load of staying in disguise, and the realization that the running community, especially for women, had layers he never fully understood. Finally, he said, "It made me appreciate the different experiences people have in this sport, and it changed how I view you and your own training." She smiled softly, reached out and squeezed his hand. "That means a lot." They packed up, made their way to the car, and headed home, the open road giving them time to reflect on the race. In the passenger seat, Michael thought back to Danielle. He hoped she was still running and finding new goals to chase. The guilt at having pretended to be someone else lingered, but he understood he couldn't fix that without drawing more attention to the deception. Back in their house that evening, as the sun set, they set their medals on the table. Laura rubbed her sore legs, and Michael did the same. Their conversation meandered from training tips to the next potential race. She teased him. "So, do you ever get the urge to run as Michelle again?" He chuckled. "Once was enough for me, but it was an eye-opener." She settled against him, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a while, the living room lights off, only the orange glow of twilight lighting the space. In that tranquil moment, they found a closeness that words couldn't fully describe. Life continued, as it always does, with work routines and weekend long runs. Yet that bet would stay with Michael forever. Sometimes when he went out for a solo jog, he'd feel the memory of that different persona pushing him on. He'd remember the camaraderie, the hush in the changing area, the new vantage point from which he saw the running world. And it gave him an added layer of respect for every runner out there, each facing challenges he might never have grasped if not for stepping into a different pair of shoes. He found himself quietly championing more inclusive dialogue around sports. He also noticed that when certain topics arose, like specialized clothing for female runners, he encouraged open-mindedness among his male friends. They teased him, saying he sounded like he'd been converted by his wife. He would just smile, not bothering to correct them. In time, his new perspective felt as natural as the stride he had cultivated over years of training. Months turned into a year. Michael and Laura never told many people about the marathon he ran as Michelle. It remained an inside story, something they jokingly referenced but rarely elaborated on. After a late summer run one morning, he found Laura sitting at the dining table, flipping through a magazine about upcoming races. She pointed to an article announcing the next edition of the women's marathon he had once run. They're opening some of their events to men now, in a separate mixed category, but they'll still have a women's-only wave. He sat down beside her, looking over the article. "That's good," he said. "Gives more options to everyone." She leaned back, a nostalgic smile on her lips. "Remember how nervous you were that morning? You could hardly hold still when we were putting on your wig." He laughed, the memory vivid. "I thought I'd be unmasked at any second. Every step felt like I was on display." Her laughter mingled with his, and then a comfortable silence settled. They both remembered the triumph and tension of that day. Finally, Laura shut the magazine and placed it on the table. "I'm glad you did it. I'm glad you understand more." He nodded. "I'm glad I did it too. Even though it was strange, it taught me a lot." They stood up and started their day. Outside, the morning sun shone bright, and the sound of cars passed by on the street. In a small glass case in the corner of Michael's office, 2 medals hung side by side, one from the women's marathon, one from the recent open marathon he had run with Laura. Both represented different journeys, different tests of will, and a shared sense of dedication. When he left for his run, he laced up his usual shoes and headed outside. The air was fresh, cool against his face. He took his first few strides down the sidewalk, feeling his pulse quicken. This time, the bet was behind him, but its impact stayed, guiding his steps with a newfound awareness. He breathed steadily, letting his legs find their natural rhythm. No matter how many times he ran, he was reminded that each step held the power to reveal something new about the roads we traverse, especially if we dare to experience them from another angle. He kept going, 1 mile, then 2, each breath a reminder of the journeys he'd taken. He was Michael, a 35-year-old marathon runner, husband to Laura, and for one unforgettable race, Michelle. That secret had stayed safe between them, but what it opened in his mind and in their marriage was undeniable. Even though he wouldn't repeat the stunt, he knew that every stride forward carried with it the memory of a time when he stepped out of his comfort zone and emerged with deeper insights into a world he once took for granted. His footsteps pattered along the sidewalk, carrying him farther into the tranquil morning. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees. He felt free, comfortable in his own skin, while remaining aware of what it had cost to momentarily step into a woman's shoes. In some ways, it enriched his approach to running, to marriage, to life. He wouldn't trade that knowledge for anything. When he finally circled back home, Laura was on the porch, waiting with a smile and a bottle of water. He climbed the porch steps, out of breath but energized. She handed him the bottle. He cracked it open, took a swig, and then paused to look at her. The significance of their bet hovered in that moment, unspoken but present. She saw it in his gaze. She chuckled, pretending not to notice. "How was the run?" He wiped his brow. "Good. Tough, but good." They stepped inside together, both aware that the road they had traveled, both literally and metaphorically, was full of lessons. They might never openly share all the details of that bet, but they would continue to carry its impact in every conversation, in every race they entered, and in the way they silently cheered each other on. And so, with the quiet hush of the morning giving way to the bustle of the day, Michael and Laura carried on, side by side, moving forward, stronger in ways they never could have anticipated.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.